good afternoon, everyone. These lights are very bright in my face. I can't see any of you, so I'll have no idea how you are actually receiving this information and responding because the lights are so bright. But I trust that you will enjoy this session. I'm glad to be back here again. As Sarah just mentioned, this is my third time on this stage. Each of these experiences is so rich. I really, really appreciate the work that the Festival of Faith does in this city. And what I did not know was that this was Sarah's last festival. And I'm very sad to hear that. I really appreciate, and I hope that you all appreciate, and actually will join me in giving a hand to Sarah. For the amazing work that she's done over the years in bringing us together for a space like this. I started working with the festival back in 2020 in a very difficult time in the midst of the aftermath of what happened in the racial reckonings of summer 2020 and Breonna Taylor in the city. And we curated some very important conversations that year that we've tried to keep that energy going in various ways throughout the subsequent years. And this year, the theme is sacred imagination. Sacred imagination. And when I was working with Sarah and the team to curate this panel, months ago, the first question that arose for me was, whose imagination? Who's imagining? Whose idea of the sacred? And if the last week and a day have shown us anything, this is an even more pressing question than it was when we first began curating this panel. Dare I say, whose imagination has to be named as nothing short of a white, supremacist, hetero-patriarchal, capitalist imagination. Yes. Whose idea of the sacred? This is a Christian nationalist imagination of the sacred in which we are all being asked to live. And that imagination of the sacred and the social order is an imagination that is at odds with and the very antithesis of everything that this festival of faith holds true. It is an exclusionary imagination. It is a violent imagination. And in many ways, it can be described as a brutal imagination that imagines and enacts what some scholars have called unlivable worlds for those of us who are marginalized from the sites of power and privilege in this country. And we have to think about what it means to be living in unlivable worlds right now that are being imagined for us. But I think we're also trying to think through the deep and rich traditions of those who have always been on the margins of power in this society, and how in those traditions there has always been a counter-imagination, a counter-sacred, that have tried to imagine other worlds, otherwise worlds that were more inclusive, that were more inhabitable, more capacious, freer than the worlds that have been imagined for us. Worlds like the ones that scholar Robin D.G. Kelley might describe in his book, Freedom Dreams. Or the kinds of worlds that the late activist minister Prathia Hall would have described as the worlds imagining by those engaged in freedom faith. And so I'm very excited at this moment to have with me a brilliant panel that I know that you will enjoy of a very diverse set of voices who will help us to interrogate these imaginaries and help us to imagine something otherwise, something that we so desperately need in this moment. So I want to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, we have Dr. Christine J. Hong. Dr. Christine Hong is the Associate Professor of Educational Ministries at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, where she focuses on the intersection of interreligious education and spiritual formation. Her research includes anti-colonial approaches to religious education, and at the center of her scholarship is a commitment to storytelling as a decolonial practice. She guides students and spiritual communities through decolonizing their religious traditions. With years of experience in the field, Christine has worked on numerous research projects and has published articles and books on pedagogy, spirituality, and decoloniality. She is a frequent workshop leader and conference speaker on decolonial pedagogy, spirituality, and JEDI, or Justice Education, Diversity, and Inclusion in educational and spiritual spaces. I'm glad to see you here with us today, Chris. We've worked together through the Louisville Institute and other spaces, and so it's good to have you with us. Dr. Christine Hong. I'll move in the order that they will actually be speaking, and that then is the gentleman to our far right, who I am just meeting today and have had the pleasure of meeting, Mr. Jose Arellano. Jose Arellano is Vice President of Operations at Homeboy Industries, the largest gang rehabilitation and reentry program in the world. The Los Angeles-based nonprofit youth program was founded by Father Greg Boyle in 1992. Raised in Los Angeles, Jose first joined the gang when he was 12 years old. He was in and out of prison over the years, and eventually he sought help from Homeboy Industries, and they gave him a job. In addition to his current role at Homeboy Industries, he also co-owns Tepito Coffee, which provides jobs to former gang members and previously incarcerated individuals. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Jose Arellano. Good to be here with you. And last but not least, we have with us someone who I've been working with virtually for the last year or so, and this is our first time actually meeting in person, so we're glad to have with us Dr. Dheepa Sundaram. Dheepa Sundaram is a professor in the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences at the University of Denver, where she specializes in hate politics, performance, ritual and digital culture in South Asian contexts. Her research examines the formation of Hindu virtual religious publics, online platforms, social media apps, and emerging technologies such as virtual reality and artificial intelligence. Her current monograph project, Globalizing Dharma, The Making of a Global Hindu Brand, examines how commercial ritual websites fashion a digital canon for Hindu religious praxis, effectively branding religious identities and marketing caste-privileged religious norms as a default cosmopolitan Hinduism that anchors the deep Hindu nationalist political project. She is also a contributor to Religion News Service on Hindu Perspectives, a founding member of the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective, and a trainer for Sacred Rights, public scholarship training program for religious scholars. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Dheepa Sundaram. And now we will hear opening presentations from each of our panelists, followed by a musical interlude. And first we will have Dr. Christine Hong.
Thank you so much for having me here. There are ancestral epistemologies, or ways of knowing inside all of us. Our ancestral epistemologies are carried in us, embodied across space and time. They're not always in a book. Ancestral epistemologies are sung generationally, like the katajak, or throat singing of Inuit people. They're embroidered, like the tatris of Palestinians, or the hanbok of Koreans. We also bear ancestral epistemologies on our hearts, or even in our DNA, as generational trauma and pain, especially those of us who are survivors of genocides, enslavements, wars, displacements. Working with ancestral epistemologies as generational pain and drawing that pain out, disentangling pain from us and our descendants is an ancestral way of reimagining. The pain must go somewhere. As a child, I learned that this type of ancestral work is magic. 1 year as a child, I was constantly sick. There were long periods of time that slipped past me. My parents were worried. I have these vague, feverish memories of my mother wiping my forehead with a cool cloth. And I remember church people sometimes gathering around, whispering these prayers around me. I remember in the evening hours, long after our household had gone to bed, my mother would come to comfort me, and I could feel her there. She would rest her warm hands on my belly, and patting gently, she would chant an old Korean folk chant that every child knows. 엄마 손은 약손, mother's hand is medicine. Something about that chant was and is magical. It pulled the pain from my body, the dull ache in my flesh absorbed into my mother's hand. Maternal magic. Something ancient, not colonizer Jesus, something else. I recently spoke with a Korean Budang, one of our shamans in diaspora, and she told me that she still practices this folk magic on her children, as do I. She also says that she practices this on herself when she's in pain, patting the part of her body that aches, saying, 조상 손은 약손, ancestor hand is medicine. The pain must go somewhere. What if yakson, or medicine hand, is something we can and should practice not only between ourselves, but on generational wounds and pain? The ones both we and our ancestors still carry. The wounds that take generations to heal. What if we practice medicine hand on the wounds carried into death and beyond? On wounds born from enslavements that crossed oceans to steal our people, to bomb our elderly and children. Genocides and holocausts that buried too many of us in unmarked graves. Wars that trampled us under empire's boots. The pain must go somewhere. Decolonizing takes a lifetime. Lifetimes. What if decolonizing imagination or ways of knowing and being means we start with the pain that traveled to us, through us, and back? The deep generational wounds and pain that course through us even now. What if our ancestors need our help just as much as we need theirs, to work with them to exorcise that shared pain? And what if in doing so, we're actually venerating one another? Ancestors' hand is medicine. Descendants' hands are medicine. The pain must go somewhere. Understanding that trauma travels opened up a different epistemological door for me. I realized that there was an entire other realm of knowledge alongside the one that I thought I knew. An ancestral realm full of pain and sorrow and joy and history and all the things that coexisted with mine in a messy jumble that I was invited to help untangle from this side of life. There was a thread that I was invited to pull through veneration, through ritual, through prayer. And the more that I pulled, the more I practiced, the more I learned about my own family's history, the more that I heard from the other side, the more I knew that our pain must go somewhere. As a grandchild of Korean people who survived Japanese occupation, only to be catapulted into a war driven by American interests of imperialism, of a people displaced, of a people cut off from family in the North, as a grandchild of a people who survived post-war Korea, who survived a puppet government of a South Korean dictatorship set up by the US, I learned that it must all go somewhere. The epistemologies of pain, joy, and hope, someone must receive it, hear it, feel it, understand it, untangle it. For many people in the diaspora, we are looking for ways to unburden ourselves from the ways our minds and lives have been colonized and recolonized, especially through religion and spiritualities that never belonged to us. Religions like Christianity, packaged and delivered through mission generations of our own people. And through the gaping maw of Christianity, we've also been force-fed the lies of white supremacy and American exceptionalism. Those lies are like thorns traveling down our throats, and we keep swallowing those thorns, especially immigrants and the children of immigrants like me. Making and remaking the immigrant bargain, we worship a white Jesus as we witness the sacrifices our parents made, and we sat still as they spoon-fed us an imagined American dream. And we chose either to rebel against them or to take on the mantle of their struggle. And we asked ourselves, how should we live to make Amma and Appa's struggle worth it? Many of us gave up our imaginations to pursue the security of our parents' imagined dream for us, a nightmare. The false safety of new homelands, our tongues forcing themselves around angular new sounds, discarding the curvature and spice of our mother tongues, and even the lineage of our names. Was it worth it? What if instead of swallowing thorns, we remembered who we were, remembered our motherlands and grandmotherlands and unbent our tongues, reclaimed our names, and what if in doing so, we undid the generational pain? What if decolonizing epistemologies meant we undo the work of the colonizer in us, in them, and what remains of the colonizer in our ancestors too? The pain goes somewhere. Working with our ancestors and speaking to them, facing them, is to see ourselves clearly, is to be the decolonized imagination, the ancestral epistemology, the way of knowing to build the future. Our decolonized imagination must go somewhere. It must live somewhere, in someone. Speaking with ancestors, dealing with our pain, our woundedness, our need for healing, reclaiming our indigenous spiritual and religious traditions is the key to understanding our deepest selves and our futures. In Korean indigenous practice, we have this ritual called hanpuri. It is a ritual of releasing sorrow, not individual sorrow, but the sorrow of the whole. A family, of a people. As we work on our own generational pain and trauma, we also release the generational pain and trauma of our ancestors, the wounds they still carry, and we receive the joy of mutual freedom, the revealing of the truth between us. Veneration as a sacred practice is a way of knowing one another, a newly imagined epistemology, wrestling with pain and living into the co-imagination of better futures, futures that hold joy, not devoid of shared histories and trauma, but ones that hold them together in the light of a possibility of liberation on this side of life and on the other side too. Do you feel it? We are in a season where for many of us, not all of us, but for many of us, our ancestors are reaching out across oceans, lands and mountains, across cultures and languages, reaching out to us, harvesting and collecting us, back unto themselves. Come, they say, return. You belong to us. We belong to you. Come, be here. The pain must go somewhere, so imagination can grow everywhere. 조상손은 약손.
Thank you so much for that. It was powerful. I thought of my mother and my grandmother. It was powerful. I'm Jose Arellano. As Brandon was saying, I'm currently Vice President of Operations at Homeboy Industries, but that wasn't always the case for me. Growing up, I come from generations of gang culture. You also inspire me, Christine. I just want to open up in my native tongue. Jose Arellano. Hello, my relatives. I'm Jose Arellano. My ancestors are from the Los Angeles Basin. We're Gabrielino Tungva. We are the original caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin. And growing up, I knew that. But there was shame around being Indian. You know, there was shame around being native, indigenous. Came with a lot of narratives, poverty, alcoholism, substance abuse issues. And for my household, also, it was plagued by the gang lifestyle. My mother was a gang member. My grandparents are all from the same neighborhood. All my uncles, all my cousins, they were all gang members. What's interesting, when I was growing up, I didn't want to be a gang member. I had this sense that everything that was happening in my household was wrong. And, you know, just seeing everything that my mother was going through, my uncles and cousins in and out of prison. And I also had an older cousin of mine that was wise beyond his years. And I remember being around like 9.5 years old. He was a couple years older than me. He calls me to my grandmother's backyard. And he says to me, he says, "Hey, primo, hey, cousin, promise me one thing, that no matter what happens, you and me, we're not going to get jumped into the barrio," which means we will not get jumped into a gang. He extends his hand, and without even thought, you know, without even having to consider the question, I said, "Of course. I promise you, primo." And we made a pact in my grandmother's backyard. It was not the end of the crack epidemic, but it was the beginning of the methamphetamine epidemic in our community, and methamphetamine just hit our community like the plague and ravaged through my household. My mother went from being a young gang member to being a full-blown drug addict. Now, we grew up poor, and we were very resilient, and, you know, being poor, to an extent, it affected us, but what little bit we had, we were able to survive amongst ourselves. But when my mother became addicted to drugs, we became extremely poor. You know, growing up poor was one thing, but we you know, lights were getting turned off, even the water. We couldn't afford the water bill. And I always say to people, I learned how to bird bath as a kid before I ever went to prison. You know, and we were just doing the best we could with what we had. But like anything, either things get progressively better or get progressively worse. And so things got progressively worse. And it was the summer right before junior high school. And, you know, at this time in my life, like I said, I didn't want to be a gang member. So I excelled in school. I did well in school. I took up the trumpet. I was in marching band. I loved school so much because I hated being at home. If I was able to live at school, I would have. I would have never came back home. That's how much I enjoyed being at school. I was in the GATE program in Los Angeles, Gifted and Talented Education. I did everything that I could to not participate in what was happening in my community and what was happening in my household. But it was the summer right before junior high school, and my cousin, the one that promised me, well, we promised each other that we would never join a gang, he got jumped into the neighborhood. From one day to the next, he was a gang member. He didn't consult with me, we didn't talk about it, it just happened. There was a friend that I had that lived down the street from us, and he had like this semi-normal life. You know, he had a stepdad, he had a mother, he had food in his refrigerator, and he had like basic cable TV. So I enjoyed being at his house. But I enjoyed being at his house so much that I would overstay my welcome. And I didn't know that as a kid growing up. You know, I wasn't conscious of those things. So, you know, me growing up, I didn't have a curfew at night. Nobody was gonna come out looking for me. I could stay out till whatever time I wanted to. Him, on the other hand, was a little bit different. So there would be times I'd be at his house and his mother, it'd be like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, and his mother would say to me, "Oh, Jose, it's getting late. You know, Christian got to go to bed. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave." You know, it was rough for her, I understand. So at this point in my life, my mother's drug addiction is really just consuming her. I didn't know who my father was. Every male in my household was in and out of prison and was violent. And so I went down the street to my friend's house one night, and I knock at the door. And somebody comes to the peephole, but they didn't answer the door. They had a side window. I go to the side window and I knock. And I say, "Hey, it's me, Jose." And they turned off the living room light, and they turned off the TV. And it just hurt, you know, it was just a moment in my life that it just felt like everything was stacked against me. I didn't have a process. I didn't know what I was feeling, but I just knew that it hurt, and it hurt a lot. My house was the hangout spot, so there was always gang members in my yard. There was always gang members at my house. I always had an excuse why not to join a gang. I'm going to band practice, or I got something going on with school. But this time I walked back to my house, and one of my other cousins, who had already been a gang member for quite some time, he was 16 years old, was in front of my house, and my homeboy, who wasn't my homeboy at the time, Lefty, was in front of my house. And I walked up to the front, and Lefty looks at me, and he says, "What's up, homie? Why you look so sad? Did your dog die or something?" And I said, "I'm not sad." And he says, "You want to get jumped into the barrio?" Before I could consider it, before I could think about it, the words had already left my mouth. And I said, "Yeah." I said, "I'll get jumped into the barrio." I said, "Matter of fact, I'll get jumped in tonight." And we walked across the street, and they beat on me viciously. They beat on me. I fell. They kicked me. They told me, "Get up." They beat on me some more. And after they were done beating on me, they hugged me and they embraced me and they said, "I love you. I love you, homie." That experience is very important to the story, because from that point on, my experience with love was fractured, you know. And that decision changed the course of my life. Shortly after that, my cousin Marlo, we made a pact in my grandmother's backyard to never join a gang. He was shot in the face with a 12-gauge shotgun. He was murdered. He was 14 years old when he died. My life it started to move really fast. Things just started to happen. I knew that death was around every corner. And it, like anything else, it got progressively worse. Imagination, you know. I remember I used to imagine my funeral. I used to close my eyes and I used to daydream about it. I used to picture my mother and wonder, will she cry? Will she stop getting high if she sees me in a casket? Who will be there if I'm murdered in the street? Will it change anything? I used to imagine that as a little boy. I used to daydream about it. At 15 years old, I got incarcerated. I got locked up for selling drugs. we were just trying to do the best we could with what we had. My grandmother at that time was really the one that was our caregiver. She was taking care of us. She was trying to, do the best she could for her daughter's children. There was 5 of us. And with her Social Security check, she tried to provide for us to keep a roof over our head. And I would watch her struggle, and I said to myself one day, like, you got to do something, And at that time, that was my best thought. And I even remember when I got arrested, I was sitting in the back seat of the cop car, and the officer walks up to me after he finds the drugs in the car, and he says, how do you being so young, why do you have so much drugs in your car? And it's in the police report, and my response to him was, I said to him, I'm just trying to feed my family, homie. There's this interesting thing about being incarcerated. It's like a curse, Once you get locked up, it's kind of hard to ever come back out here again. I know that sounds crazy, but as I look back on it now, I believe it's because of the dehumanization of, what happens to us while we're in there. Being 15 years old, and in my mind, being kind of like a grown man already, but being asked to strip naked, being asked to be in this concrete tomb. You don't have no books, you don't have no pencil, you can't even wear your shoes in there. And you're in there for 23 and a half hours a day, and these are kids, we're kids. You hope that you come out for rec, but most of the time you don't. They decide, if you come out for showers. I think you get showers every 3 days. I don't know if it's still like that. So I come home 4 months later, and then immediately I reoffend. At 16, I go back. At 18, I get out. At 18, I go back. At 22, I get out. At 22, I go back, and this time I'm fighting a life sentence, 55 years to life. I didn't ever get to spend a birthday out here. And it was interesting because as much as I would want to not ever go back to that place, somehow I always found my way back to that place. It was like a curse. But I remember one vivid memory at 16 years old while I was in there. I remember waiting for visiting. And I would always stand on my cell door. There was these little windows, and I could see the visiting room from my cell. And I would watch kids get called out, and I would wait, and I would listen for my name. And I would hope that maybe my mother would clean up and maybe she would come visit me. And I don't know, there was like these little bags of popcorn that they would give the kids when they got visits. We didn't get them if we didn't get visits. And I was a kid, so there was something about that little bag of popcorn, I just wanted one of those little bags of popcorn. And then I remember one night, one evening, they're calling visits, and then visiting's over. And I said to myself, I walked to the back of the cell and I said, Jose, no one's coming to see you, homie. Stop this. This is your life. This is the hand that was dealt, and you're going to play it till it's over. And it kind of went from knowing that death was around every corner and being cautious to accepting that death was coming and then meeting it in the street. And saying, if you're coming for me, I want to meet you in the street. And I began to pursue death. And that's how I lived my life. And at 22, I was fighting a life sentence. And what's interesting is I fought a case for a crime I did not commit. I was arrested. There was a shooting in my neighborhood. I had just come home from prison, so I wasn't out that long. I got arrested. I remember when I got locked up and they said, I got my discovery and they said the shooter didn't have any facial hair. And he was 5'7", 5'8". I was 6'1", full goatee and mustache. But because of my gang tattoos, I was bounded over to Superior. And I eventually took a plea bargain because that's just life. That's how we live. Doesn't matter if you did it or not. We're just going to survive through this no matter what. And I took my plea bargain and I caught the chain. And by this time, the relationship with my mother was so estranged, it's like we didn't really have a relationship. And I'll give you an example. Homies from my neighborhood, because my mother's from the same gang as me, they would come to me while I was out and they would say to me, hey, homie, your mom's over here in an alley or in a garage getting high. You should probably go check on her. My response to them was, I don't have a mother, homie. Because that's how hurt I was. That's how broken I was. So here I am, like fish to water. I'm back in it, not thinking of anything different, not even really desiring anything different. And I catch the chain, and when I got to the pen, I got word that my mother had died in her addiction. By this time in my life, I felt like I didn't have a heart to be broken. You know, I didn't desire love or to be loved. And I had experienced a lot of pain, a lot of loss, a lot of death. But there was nothing that I can compare to this pain. No matter what I did, like I tried to stuff it down, drank manufactured alcohol, participated in violence. I just couldn't run from this pain. And it wasn't like my heart was broken, it was like my soul was broken. And I did everything I could. I even put a needle in my arm. I went from being a gang member to being a drug addict. And I realized something while I was in there. I realized that everything that I hated, I became. Everything I grew up as a kid despising and not wanting to participate in, everything I hated, I became. And then I got to understand my mother. Because God only knew what she had been through as a child. I heard stories from my grandmother, brief little stories. My grandmother didn't have the capacity to even hug us because she had experienced so much trauma, so much pain, so much racism, so much violence. She was an orphan at 12. And she did the best she could with what she had, But if pain is not transformed, then pain is transmitted. And so it was passed down. I was in the hole. I was doing my last shoot term in the hole. And I remember, that saying, everywhere you go, there you are. And I had to eventually look myself in the mirror, literally. And we have these little square mirrors that are stuck to the wall in the hole. And I remember looking at myself one day. And inside of myself, I asked myself, who are you? How did you get to this point? How did you get here? Sat on my bunk and I started to think about my life being a kid. When I was a little kid, I would watch a bunch of sitcoms, but in particular, these two sitcoms. One was Family Matters and one was It's a Small Wonder. And I started to reflect on that. And what I loved about those shows is that I love the family dynamics that those shows had. The mom, the dad, they ate dinner together. I always desired that life. And here I was in prison desiring that life again. So there was this little glimmer of desire to have something different, but I didn't know if it was possible anymore. I came home and my first intent was get a job. If you get a job, you can contribute, you can provide. But what was so interesting this time is I wasn't acclimating anymore. I just felt like I didn't fit in out here anymore. And I had all these things that I was feeling inside that I didn't even have the words to identify them. I just felt like I didn't fit in anymore. And it was only a matter of time before I would go back to prison. I stumbled upon Homeboy Industries, the number to Homeboy Industries, and I called down there. And a homie answers the phone. And I say to him, hey, are you guys hiring? And he says, well, let me ask you a few questions. I say, okay. He goes, have you ever been locked up before? I'm like, what kind of question is this? I'm calling for a job. I say, yeah, I just got out. He says, have you ever been involved with gangs? I say, yeah, I'm a gang member. He says, are you currently on probation or parole? I say to him, I'm on high control parole. He says, okay, one more question. Do you have any visible tattoos on your neck, face, hands, arms? I was all tatted up back then. I had big block letters on my arms, had my face tatted. As you can see, I still have my neck. And I remember looking at myself and I say to him, I said, yeah, homie, I'm all tatted up. He says, okay, we'll give you a job. I'm like, what? And I say, are you serious? He says, yeah, can you come down here today? And I would love to say that I went down there and the rest was history, but it just wasn't. I had a lot of work to do, a lot of internal work to do. I had to identify things like PTSD, social anxiety, paranoia, these things that I had been through as a child, but also these things that I had been through in institutions. Our experiences, they shape us though. They shape the way we view ourselves and they shape the way we view the world. And I'm gonna share one big experience that I had and then I'll end with that. That helped me to see myself in a different manner, but also to see the world and see myself in it. I locate my little brother, and I talk to Father G, and I say, hey G, I found my brother, can we, bring him, can you help him? And he says, sure, son. We'll bring him in, and we'll give him a part-time job, and we'll put him in one of our schools. So back then, my brother he didn't speak much. The only way he knew how to express himself was physically and violently. And there was even moments where I thought, man, he doesn't even like me. But I didn't know what he had been through as a kid. He was out here when my mother had died. He had been through a lot, I'll just say that. So back then, we didn't have much, and when I say we didn't have much, we didn't have anything but the clothes on our back. So back then, if I had these pants on today, my brother would have them on tomorrow. And we would switch out clothes. And we were kind of just taught, never ask anybody for anything because they'll take advantage of you. So one day we come in, and the homie at the front desk says, hey, Father G wants to speak to you two. I look over at my little brother what did you do, homie? Thinking we're in trouble, right? We go in, and G has these 2 Sears cards in his hands. And he reaches across his desk, and he says, hey, take these cards, son. We say, nah, Pops, we're good. We don't need anything. He says, take these cards and go buy yourself some clothes, son. Reluctantly, we took the cards and we leave. Now, I'm ashamed to say this, but this is how we grew up. When we were growing up, I would tell my little brothers, don't ever cry. Don't ever demonstrate weakness because people will take advantage of you. And here I am leaving homeboys. We're going down Alameda, and my little brother's sobbing. He's in tears. He's crying. And I look over at him, and I say to him, why are you crying, homie? And he says to me, excuse my language, but he says, why the fuck do they care about us so much? He couldn't wrap his head around it. Now, I wish I would have told him, I wish I would have said to him, because you matter, because you're a good kid, because you deserve better, because you should have never went through all the things you went through. But I didn't say anything. But my heart was altered forever. That experience changed the course of my life. And I was ready to be a part of Homeboy Industries and ready to create experiences that would help reshape people's minds and hearts. And it's the privilege of my life to be a part of Homeboys and to be vice president of operations and to also be here to share the story with you all. Thank you.
Well, I have to follow those two, so that's great for me. Based on the reflections, I actually think it's good for me to respond. I was going to open with one story, but I think I'll open with two and cut some of my other remarks. But to follow Dr. Chris, right, I will also share a small chant that I grew up with. Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritam gamaya om shanti 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 Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Those were the last words my grandfather spoke before he passed. And what it means is lead me from darkness to light, from, untruth to truth, darkness to light, and then finally from death to immortality. And maybe some of you have heard the word Shanti before as peace. But the last phrase, Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu, means let everyone in the world experience the same joy that I do. It seems like a beautiful sentiment, and it's one that I was raised with, chanted very regularly. But what I want to talk about today is the question that Dr. McCormack started us with, which is whose imagination? I write about Hindu publics, and I write about them in digital spaces, but I also write about hate politics. And one of the things that I think animates me is precisely that question. When we imagine a public, Are we imagining the contradictions in that public? The beauty of imagining other people's happiness is often undermined when we think about how it undercuts our own. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. So I am now going to give a small trigger warning because I'm going to discuss a bomb threat. So going from what I just said to a bomb threat with my second story. If this conference goes forward, I will become Osama bin Laden and bomb everyone. I hope you will not mistake me. This threat was received at an academic conference that I was a part of, that I was organizing. In 2021, I joined as an organizer for a conference on dismantling global Hindutva. Hindutva is the Indian neologism for Hindu nationalism. Hindu nationalism is a nativist far-right ideology akin to white supremacy or white Christian nationalism, which believes that India was a homeland only for Hindus and all others are invaders. This particular conference was academic inquiry. It was held online. Most academic conferences don't have a lot of people who attend. I will say, as I speak for my fellow academics, we are pretty excited when 30 people show up. This particular conference, because of the topic, ended up eliciting 30,000 impressions on YouTube. It was live streamed by 2 different TV stations, but you might wonder why. It shouldn't have been. It was because of these kinds of threats. And the ways in which this animated a particular group of folks. We have these organizations that purport to be Hindu advocates that are on US soil, but instead they are apologists for this particular supremacist ideology. They find common cause with white supremacists and white Christian nationalists, and it looks like we may have a few of those in our current government coming to be. But it's not surprising to me to see that kind of supremacist ideology making friends and solidarities with other supremacist ideologies. This particular conference was a group of scholars and journalists and activists from all over the world. Dozens of prominent institutions from Harvard to Yale to Stanford to University of Toronto, University of Virginia, University of Pennsylvania sponsored the conference. But it also gathered widespread condemnation from Hindu nationalist organizations like the Hindu American Foundation, or the Coalition of North American Hindus, or the Vishwa Hindu Parishad America. All of these organizations instituted a massive letter writing campaign, which actually crashed the servers at Drew University, which was a sort of weirdly hilarious thing that happened. What do you want? What were they asking, right? What were they concerned about? They said, some suggested, I should say, that critiquing any aspect of India or Hindu cultural ideas would result in the harm to Hindus, right? Particularly Hindu students, they believed. Others said that the conference was inherently Hindu-phobic because Hindu nationalism and Hinduism are inseparable. Still others suggested that this was an example of the West exporting their quote-unquote woke ideas of social justice and imposing them on Indian and Hindu culture in a modern act of cultural colonization, right? Despite the threats, despite all of the trauma, I will tell you, I spent a week on my own couch, huddled in my pajamas, afraid to leave the house because of the death threats and rape threats that I was getting to my personal email. I thought about my grandfather's chant. I thought about how I was raised with this idea of Vasudeva Kutumbakam. The whole world is my family. The idea that we should always be living in equanimity with others, that everyone is part of the same world. And then watching people purporting to be a part of the religion in which I was raised in, literally sending me death threats and rape threats. And how can I hold those two together? But the threat here was not to Hindus. The threat was not to Hinduism. The threat was to very specifically Hindu exceptionalism. They alone are discriminated or victimized. Hinduism cannot afford critique, right? Certainly not to the facets of the tradition. But it was more than that. This was an abdication of responsibility to look inward at our own biases, our own prejudices, our own types of supremacies that are internal. I submit that without examining such baked-in supremacies of our spiritual and religious traditions, any imagined unity will always be exclusionary. The pluralism and contradictions inherent within Hindu traditions are lost when groups suggest that we cannot look at our own supremacies. Things like, for example, caste discrimination. These same groups have opposed legislation preventing caste discrimination. For those of you that don't know what that is, that's a social hierarchy that tells people that you get to be in a particular job or a particular rung of society because of which family you were born into, right? Critiques of Hindu nativism, right? That India can only ever be a homeland for Hindus. What happens to the 200+ million Muslims who have lived there for generations, or Christians, or the indigenous Jewish population, or more importantly, the group that always gets lost, what we call the Adivasis, or the first dwellers, the indigenous people of India, right? In a Hindu world, what happens to those people? What otherwise world do they have? Right? I would suggest that should be the opposite, that only through deep introspection and sitting with discomfort, as feminist scholar Sarah Ahmed teaches us, can we truly move forward towards inclusive and multiple-oriented imaginaries that can advance a shared inclusive future for all. In the Hindu context, this means grappling honestly with our community's anti-Blackness, our community's ingrained Islamophobia, our community's traditionalist casteism, which have become a part of the fabric of the Hindu nationalist vision, but have always undergirded, grounded Hinduism. They are also Hindus. Hindu nationalists are Hindus. Those that oppose it are Hindus. How do we sit with those kinds of dissonances? To be clear, these concerns, right, are not something outside. They are concerns that we all hold and have to grapple with, right? We must sit with that kind of dissonance and fracture in honest ways. We must confront them in order to move forward into an imagined community that can be plural and dissonant while still holding together. I want to not take up too much of our time so that we have more time for discussion. So let me end with one final reflection on the phrase that I gave you earlier, Vasudeva Kutumbakam. Vasudeva Kutumbakam has been taken by Hindu nationalists to be deployed as a certain kind of family, an exclusionary belonging that only those that fit the metric of this majoritarian Hindu vision can truly belong. They have, what I would say is cannibalized the languages of indigeneity and indigenous belonging. But we can take it back. And it starts with this phrase. This notion of Vasudeva Kutumbakam can be a place that we can begin with a radical belonging. What if Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the whole world is my family, means we can sit in dissonance, we can sit in disagreement, we can sit with cultural difference and actually hold all of those with equity? What if radical belonging meant I don't have to be in the same spiritual place as you? What if radical belonging meant I can treat all with humanity, right? By reclaiming Vasudeva Kutambakam, we can advance a different vision of belonging and inclusivity in which justice and equity shape the notion of family, where we don't shy away from our shortcomings. We confront them. We sit with the discomfort of knowing that, for example, my own position here was wrought in part, yes, by immigrants, but also with caste privilege that I hold. That I can sit with the fact that many family members that I have engaged in unbelievable anti-Black practices, that many of my own family in India today continue to advance very disturbing and violent Islamophobic ideas. I can critique those without feeling like my own tradition has been somehow undermined. Where discomfort is the key of interrogation of our own positions of vulnerability as well as privilege. Where othering of traditions that feel foreign is rejected in favor of a politics of holding difference as love. And I'm going to stop there. You made me throw out my whole talk.
That's so good.
I just made that up.
Great, thank you. So much has been said. And that is why it is so appropriate that we have a musical interlude right now so that we can gather ourselves and our thoughts for the conversation to come. Thank you.
Hello. I was going to play something entirely different for you today, but since we're all singing so much, this is a song written by Gene Taylor, not the honky-tonk pianist, but the great jazz bassist, composer, and music educator. He wrote this song in its entirety on the morning of April 5th, 1968, and it was debuted that night as sung by Miss Nina Simone. Once upon this planet Earth lived a man of humble birth, preaching love and freedom for his fellow man. He was dreaming of the day peace would come on earth to stay, and he spread this message all across the land. Turn the other cheek, he plead, love thy neighbor was his creed. Pain, humiliation, and death he did not dread, and with his Bible by his side, from his foes he would not hide. It's hard to think that this great man is dead. Will the murders ever cease? Are we men or are we beasts? What do people, what do they hope to gain? Will your nation stand or fall? too late for us all. And did Martin Luther King just die in vain? But he had seen the mountain top, and he knew he could not stop. Always living with a threat of death ahead. Warn your children to stop and think, 'cause we're headed for the brink. What's gonna happen now that the king of love is dead? He was for equality, for our people, you and me, full of love and goodwill. Hate was not his way. He was not a violent man. So tell me if you can, why was he gunned down the other day? Call it prejudice, call it hate. Tell him bigotry sealed his fate. Go on, cry, cry, cry. Your tears won't change a thing. Will my country never learn? Must we kill at every turn? We've got to know by now what the consequences will bring. But he has seen the mountaintop, and he knew he could not stop. Always living with the threat of death ahead. We'd all better stop and think, 'cause we're well beyond the brink. What's gonna happen? What's gonna happen now that the king of love is dead?
Thank you so much for that. Sis can sing a little bit, huh? Yeah, she was all right. I could listen to that even more. A song about Martin Luther King Jr., interestingly enough, whose sacred imagination could be characterized as the beloved community. Something, again, that seems so much at odds with the imaginaries that we've been describing here, because the ethos of what we're experiencing now in our society is anything but a beloved community. You all have put so much on the table, right? I mean, and we only have about 15 minutes left. So this creates significant challenges for the moderator.
Good luck.
How do we begin to tie together what seem like potentially disparate threads of narratives that are coming from different sets of experiences and yet share a number of commonalities, right? We began with this question of whose imagination. And from the opening commentary, Christine, you give us this colonizing imagination that estranges us from ancestral epistemologies, our ways of knowing, right? That come in and colonize our imaginations in the very ways that we can imagine our relationality with one another, our ways of being in the world, and the ways in which we organize society, right? And we have to fight to reclaim those ways of knowing. But those are colonizing imaginations are very violent, right? And it causes pain and trauma. And I love what you talk about. The pain has to go somewhere. It has to live somewhere, because we can't live with it in our bodies because it does violence to us, and we're trying to exercise that, right? And so many things. And so I want to hold that. Jose, when you talk about your narrative, right? This very painful personal experience, and what comes up for me is, again, this colonizing imagination that you talk about being these indigenous folks and keepers of the LA basin, but not being able to identify with that early on, right? Because there's so much shame around it, right? Because that imagination in space and geography too has been colonized, right? And people pushed off of land and away from traditions and away from senses of self and ways of knowing, and then replaced with another violent imagination that becomes a carceral imagination, right? That can only be a logic of incarcerating and containing those bodies, right? That were pushed off land to begin with and can never be imagined as free. That lead to a deathly imagination because you want to come out and meet death in the street. That was so poignant, right? And so it is a brutal set of imaginaries, right? And then with Dheepa, I hear you saying that this colonizing imagination, right? There's another side of that even among formerly colonized people become can then respond to that with their own supremacist and exceptionalist ideas of themselves that become oddly and ironically, right, oppressive in other ways. And then how do we imagine something different? And so each of you have given us a lot to think with, right? But if you would just say something else about, again, how those imaginaries harm us, why we really need to interrogate them, because they're doing real harm to us as individuals and as people, right? If you just say a little bit more about the reasons why we have to interrogate these imaginaries because they're doing such harm in the world.
One of the things I realized, like in doing some of this spirituality work with ancestor veneration and undoing the harm that a lot of our indigenous spiritualities have undergone through the auspices of like colonizer traditions, is that I realized like even in death, my ancestors aren't free. And that like shakes me to my core. Even in death, my ancestors aren't free from the war. Like they're buried on mountains that I can't reach because of American militarism. You know, like there are THAAD missiles on those mountains that are holy to my people, right? So even in death. So what do we do? Like those politics matter, right? The politics that happen on this land, the white supremacists, the white supremacism, the American exceptionalism, the US militarism, the continued like, the empire, the imperial core, all of those things still matter to them on the other side. So me working towards that type of freedom here matters to them on the other side too. So all of that, it's like kind of decentering humanity and recentering cosmology really matters to them too, right? The decentering of the humanness and recentering of the otherness, the more than humanness, matters to other beings too. But so much of that American exceptionalist is just us, right? And so there's something about that. There's something about like, there's more sacred than just being American. There's more sacred than just being human. Those lands also want to be free. Those mountains want to be free. Our ancestors who are on the other side of this human life still want to be free. Those people that didn't get burial in those mass graves want to be free still. And we forget that.
And it is still our responsibility while we have breath to do that work.
I agree. I just want to, I agree so much with Christine that even in death, they're not free, but also, and I would also say that through death, they've been able to also help set us free. Like, because I think about my mother, and this might sound crazy to some, but she was able to do more for me in death than she was able to do for me in life. And when you think about the sacrifices that have been made, like our ancestors have made for us to have the progress that we have, for us to continue to be able to sacrifice. And we were mentioning MLK right now, and him at 33 years old sacrificed his life. When people said to him, like, don't preach right now, let things die down. And he went forward and onward and sacrificed not just his life, but so much more, his commitment, his time. And I just think about, so I agree with Christine, is like, and I ask myself, this is for me, is like, what am I sacrificing today? Because everything, like in my culture, even when Tongva means literally people of the earth. And we believe to be caretakers of the earth, and with being caretakers of the earth comes sacrifice. And so I got to ask myself, with the sacrifices that were made for me to be where I'm at, what sacrifices am I making to propel and to make this place better for the next 7 generations? And that might mean I might not get to see the house fully built. But what bricks am I laying? What bricks am I laying in my own personal life and professional life? Because our ancestors have sacrificed for us. And there is this connection between both worlds to what they were able to do and what I'm able to do in this physical realm.
Dheepa?
I think for me, it's a bit different. I think, I'm hearing, this connection between the ancestors, but I think part of what I would love for us to rethink is how, first of all, let me say it this way. I want us to acknowledge the desires and the pull of supremacy. Supremacy is an imaginary. That's part of the problem, right? Imaginary isn't beautiful always. And that is what I was hoping to draw attention to, is that colonialism is an imaginary that is animating to the colonized because it's power, and power is an imaginary. We partly need to think about addressing our own pulls towards these imaginaries that are destructive to our own communities. And that is what I think for me is at odds with my grandfather's words. He died 7 years ago, 8 years ago, in a world that I don't think he would recognize today. He would not recognize the world today, but in part because what people have thought of as liberatory is a replication of the very things that he fought against when he was under colonial rule. That, to me, is precisely why we need to free our ancestors, to go back to Christine, because we cannot give in to those dark desires. We must fight them. They are also imaginaries, and they're competing ones.
I think people need to be responsible in their communities, like you're saying. Like, be responsible in your community to do that work with your people. Like, I feel like we, as the people here, are doing that work with our people.
Right.
But every time we see an election, and we see, and I have feelings about exit polls because of who does them and how fast they come out. And as someone that does qualitative research and quantitative research, I'm suspicious of how quickly they come out and who does them, right? So anyway, but when we see them, and they do, the disaggregated ones tend to come out around Thanksgiving. But when we see them, you can see who actually has community and does that work, and you can see who doesn't actually have community and is avoiding doing the work. Okay?
Say more.
So, I need white people to do the work. I need white women to do the work. Find community. I don't need a blue bracelet. Okay? I need white women to find one another and do the work. Not just after election time. I will probably never live to see a more progressive time anymore. I'm realizing this, that I am going to live and die in this America now, okay? And I'm gonna fight tooth and nail for my children, okay? But I need people to fight alongside me and not just posture that they're going to do that and mourn and whisper to me on this side that they're sad about that. Like, I truly need allies. Like, I need solidarity. So I'm fighting hard for my ancestors and people at this table with my people in community. Deepa's doing that, right? Jose's doing that. Brandon's doing that, but I need others to do it too. But in order to do that, you need to find your own people. That's why not everybody's ancestors are calling to them. Because some of your ancestors need to heal too, and it's up to you to do that work with them.
Hates have solidarities too, and we need to break those.
Yes. Anyway, I'm done.
Listen, Christine, you said a lot.
I know, so I'm done, sorry.
Right? No. Ain't no apologies for that, what you just said.
No, this is it. This is the right
thing. Because it
thing.
needed to be said and it needed to be named, and I hope we will continue to have these conversations in the hallways and out, and you will continue to have these conversations in the communities, because we only have, according to this monitor, 3 minutes and 42 seconds. That's not much to do much with, but let me ask you this. You talk about the work that needs to be done. You can see who's not doing the work, right? And this is a call for people to do the work within the community. Perhaps we can end on, when Christina Sharp, a scholar I think with a lot, who wrote a book called In the Wake on Blackness and Being, where she talks about part of our work as activists and academics and scholars and writers is to, in the midst of the brutal imagination, in the midst of the unlivable worlds that are being enacted, right? Part of our work is to locate, right, those spaces of resistance where other kind of work is being done to open up more livable space, right? To shine a light on that work and to help expand it, right? Where do you see that kind of work being done, right, that we can expand upon right now to create more livable worlds?
What I've been thinking a lot about alongside one of my own colleagues is rethinking civil religion. Maybe some of you have heard that term before, but it's a belief in a particular kind of imaginary of America, right? That we are different, that we are, maybe you've heard this, that we have possibility here in a way that maybe Europe didn't or other places don't, right? That has always felt exclusionary to me. But there are Black scholars that are reimagining civil religion to be a different imaginary, a different kind of we, right? So perhaps for me, and this is partly what I've been thinking through with some Muslim scholars who are thinking about where they fit in American democracy. What does democratic joy look for them? Like, what does it do? And so that's what I've been thinking about, is the margins of that particular world and bringing them to the center. Imagining a pluralism, a we in America that is truly inclusive of all of our difference. And one of the things that has always been animating to me is that difference is unity. We don't need to all agree. We can hold each other's difference with humanity. And I'm not suggesting that you go and hang out with your neighborhood white supremacist. What I'm saying is you should be able to, no, I am not saying that, and I am definitely not doing that. But I'm saying, I am saying, though, that partly what we don't need today is to say, we hear calls for unity after every election. I find that to be BS. That's not what I'm saying here. What I'm saying here is that we ourselves can hold critiques of each other with empathy and care, leading and holding each other's pain. Instead of saying, you are a terrible person, we need to be able to interrogate pain and hold that and move forward. That does not mean agree. It just means that we need to be able to find those moments where we all understand that we are all human beings and that we can hold each other's pain and move forward. I mean, at least for me, that is what I have been doing in my own community, but it's also the way that I want to break what I see as really problematic alliances between, for example, Indians in this country and white supremacists, which is a problem whether or not folks see it or not.
I would just add one thing. I know we're out of time, but it's not enough to just imagine. We got to be able to reach out and touch it. It has to be hope in the flesh. We got to continue to consider like who's not at the table, and continue to work with our communities. Continue to model what healing looks like, what our true narrative should be. It can't come from an external force. It got to be our true culture, our true traditions, our practices, and we got to be not ashamed to announce those to the world, and even within our own community, to say, hey, that's not cultural, that's not traditional, that's not ancestral. Now, I don't want to wave my finger at you, but let me model why there's a circle, why there's no hierarchy, because the circle, there's no beginning, there's no end. And this is in a lot of our traditions. And for us to be able to, well, who's not in this circle? That needs to be, even if it's the forgotten one or the criminalized one or the person in our community that society has deemed to not be the one to participate in this conversation, we need to elicit those voices, and we need to be hope in the flesh. And it can't just be an imagination anymore. It got to really be tangible.
And with that, the clock has hit triple zeros. We are at 2:01, and Owsley is standing anxiously aside. Listen, I think any good panel leaves us wanting more conversation, right? We certainly haven't exhausted this conversation, and hopefully we will take this out again into the hallways, into the break rooms, into the receptions, and into your communities, and extend these conversations that we so desperately need to have in these moments. Thank you all so much for being here, and would you please join me again in giving a hand to our esteemed panel.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you so much.